Hello everyone, today I greet you from the heart of Bavaria. Welcome to Munich. Now I'm currently just around the corner from the Promenadenstraße. It's a typically peaceful and quiet Munich street, but it wasn't always like this. It would be here that on February 21st, 1919, one of history's most infamous political assassinations would occur. A man would walk down the street with his resignation letter inside his briefcase. He was about to deliver it to Parliament. His name was Kurt Eisner. He was just a journalist, but months earlier had toppled the entire Bavarian monarchy. Now, he would never get to deliver that letter. 2 gunshots would be heard, and Kurt Eisner would collapse on the sidewalk, a memorial now standing in the place where he fell. But those bullets didn't just kill one man, they killed Bavaria's last chance for a peaceful democracy and triggered a chain reaction that would consume Munich in communist revolution and civil war. What happened in Bavaria would become a turning point. It would shape the destruction of German democracy itself. Today, I'd like to tell you the story of how one assassination started Germany's first communist revolution. To understand why Eisner's death unleashed a communist revolution, we need to analyze just how unlikely his rise to power was in the first place. Kurt Eisner was born in 1867 in Berlin, the son of a Jewish shopkeeper who sold military decorations to the Kaiser's army. As a boy, he celebrated Prussian military victories and considered Social Democrats dangerous criminals. Everything pointed towards a comfortable bourgeois life, but at 22 he abandoned his doctoral studies to become a journalist. That choice defined everything. Eisner wasn't really a politician by trade. He was a man of words who genuinely believed reason and persuasion could transform society. Years of writing exposed him to what he saw as the hypocrisies and cruelties of Imperial Germany. He joined the Social Democratic Party and became one of their leading journalists, writing articles that dissected the establishment while arguing for gradual democratic change. But then came World War I, and with it the great crisis that would split German socialism in two. You see, before 1914, the German Social Democratic Party, the SPD, was committed to international working class solidarity. Socialists were supposed to oppose all wars as conflicts between capitalist nations that sent workers to kill each other. So with the outbreak of World War I, they were theoretically supposed to refuse, to strike, and to unite across borders. But instead, in August of 1914, the SPD voted to support war credits in the Reichstag. Their reasoning was that they had to defend Germany against Russian autocracy in order to protect the workers' movement itself. This Burgfrieden, or civic peace, meant socialists would suspend class struggle for national unity, putting aside their differences during wartime in Germany. Now, initially, Eisner supported the war, but as it dragged on, the fracture only deepened. He started to feel like the conflict was no longer about protecting workers at all. Why was Germany occupying so much foreign land? To him, this was now a betrayal. In 1917, those who opposed the war, like Eisner, decided to break away entirely, forming the Independent Social Democratic Party, or the USPD. The USPD demanded immediate peace without any annexations. This was the split that tore German socialism apart. While the majority SPD continued supporting the war, the USPD accused them of selling out the workers for seats at the table of power. It was Eisner who became one of the USPD's leading voices. His anti-war writings landed him in prison twice, and when he emerged in October of 1918, Germany was collapsing around him. 4 years of blockade, starvation, and death, with sailors now mutinying across naval bases, meant that the government was falling apart. But Eisner's time in prison had transformed more than just his opposition to Germany's continued involvement in war. Watching the SPD leadership vote for war credits while workers died in the trenches had convinced him that traditional parliamentary democracy was fundamentally flawed. How could representatives truly speak for the people when they could so easily betray their most basic promises? The USPD's answer was what they called council democracy, and Eisner became one of its most passionate advocates. But what exactly is council democracy, and what did Eisner believe in? I'm going to try to explain this simply, but you'll have to bear with me for a second. So, his vision wasn't to replace Parliament, but create a sort of dual power. Workers' councils would share authority with elected representatives to form the ultimate democratic representation. Basically, imagine that workers in each factory, military soldiers in each unit, and peasants in each village would elect councils that would have an advisory role alongside the elected parliament. These councils wouldn't replace parliamentary democracy, but they would give working people a permanent voice in government beyond just voting every few years. The councils would oversee public administration, provide feedback on legislation, and ensure that the people's voice was heard between elections. For Eisner and his followers, the key was returning to democracy's original meaning. The word democracy comes from the Greek demokratia, literally rule of the people. But what did that actually mean? It's subjective in a sense. Was democracy simply about casting ballots every few years, or did true rule by the people require something more direct and continuous? This was the proposed dual parliament-council system. The problem was that nobody knew exactly how this would work in practice. Which body would have final authority when they disagreed? How would you reconcile parliamentary majorities with council decisions? Eisner's grand design demanded voluntary cooperation between two completely different forms of democracy, and it was an open question whether that cooperation could materialize. Furthermore, it was a solution that left everyone unhappy. It was too radical for parliamentary Democrats, but not radical enough for pure council advocates. So, now that we've covered some of his political beliefs, there is something about Eisner's character that we need to discuss that will become decisive in this story. Eisner was a pacifist who refused to use force, an idealist striving for more authentic forms of government beyond mere elections, and a journalist who thought speeches could substitute for political action. Years of imprisonment had made him fanatical about free expression. He truly didn't believe he had the right to suppress opposition, even the communists who were trying to destroy him. These principles made him admirable as a human being, but they perhaps also made him catastrophically inadequate as a revolutionary leader. November 7th began as a planned rally here on Munich's Theresienwiese. The government allowed the rally to proceed, confident in its new legitimacy. But what transformed this gathering into a revolution was the presence of about 1,000 or so German sailors who had been recently transferred from naval bases where mutinies had broken out. These sailors would bring with them the revolutionary spirit that was spreading across Germany at the time. By evening, what had begun as a political demonstration had now morphed into something far more serious. In the Matthäuserboy beer hall, which sadly no longer exists today but was a quintessential Bavarian institution, Eisner would be elected as chairman of the Council of Soldiers and Workers. It was likely the first time he had ever held political office, but it would make him one of the most powerful men in Bavaria. Now, King Ludwig III was having a beautiful evening walk in his English garden when he got wind that a revolution was starting, and he decided his best course of action would be to immediately flee the city. But the actual coup was almost anticlimactic. Armed soldiers occupied strategic buildings and transportation hubs. Newspaper offices were seized to print proclamations. By morning, Munich woke up to yellow placards announcing the Bavarian Republic. This is the actual proclamation that appeared on Munich streets on November 8th. Let's listen to Eisner's words in German and then in English. Nach jahrelanger Vernichtung aufzubauen, hat das Volk die Macht der Zivil- und Militärbehörden gestürzt und die Regierung selbst in die Hand genommen. Die Bayerische Republik wird hierdurch proklamiert. Die oberste Behörde ist der von der Bevölkerung gewählte Arbeiter-, Soldaten- und Bauernrat, der provisorisch eingesetzt ist, bis eine endgültige Volksvertretung geschaffen wird. Er hat gesetzgeberische Gewalt. Die ganze Garnison hat sich der republikanischen Regierung zur Verfügung gestellt. Generalkommando und Polizeipräsidium stehen unter unserem Befehl. Die Dynastie Wittelsbach ist abgesetzt. Hoch die Republik der Arbeiter- und Soldatenrat. Kurt Eisner. Fellow citizens, in order to rebuild after long years of destruction, the people have overthrown the power of the civil and military authorities and have taken the regime into their own hands. The Bavarian Republic is hereby proclaimed. Elected by the citizens and provisionally instituted until a definitive representation of the people is created, the Council of Workers, Soldiers, and Peasants is the highest authority. It has law-giving power. The entire garrison has placed itself at the disposal of the Republican regime. The General Command and the Police Presidium stand under our direction. The Wittelsbach dynasty is deposed. Long live the Republic, the Council of Workers and Soldiers. Kurt Eisner. So it had actually happened. Kurt Eisner and his boys had now seized power and toppled the entire government. But how did a small group of followers around Eisner overthrow the monarchy, one that had just enacted sweeping democratic reforms with broad popular support? The answer lies in the fact that Bavaria's political landscape was fragmenting into factions that would tear the state apart. In Bavaria, there were 6 political factions that would choose ideology over democracy when the critical moment of crisis came. First, there were the mainstream Social Democrats, the SPD, which we've already spoken a lot about. They represented workers who wanted gradual reform through parliamentary democracy, but they would prove too constrained in this crisis by democratic principles to stop extremists. Eisner himself, as we've covered, led the Independent Socialists, the USPD. These were radicals who'd broken away from the SPD over the war and supported council democracy. Because of this, they would refuse to accept any electoral defeat, because elections to them weren't the only thing they considered actually democratic. But now there are the others that we have yet to discuss. There were the Communists, the KPD, who were still organizing in the shadows, waiting for their moment to push for a full Soviet dictatorship. They understood power, perhaps in ways the others didn't. They are going to be important for our story, so I will have to explain their strategy in a little bit more detail. Unlike the other parties, the Communists had no illusions about elections. They viewed them as bourgeois theater designed to legitimize capitalist exploitation. While Social Democrats debated coalition building and Eisner theorized about council cooperation, the Communists were studying the Bolshevik playbook from Russia. To them, political power didn't flow through the parliament or through the councils, but it flowed from the barrel of a gun. There would be no ballot boxes or parliamentary procedures. Where other parties saw political opponents to be persuaded, it was the Communists who saw enemies of the working class to be eliminated. Society would be smashed entirely and then rebuilt from the ground up. It's important to note that the KPD was receiving direct guidance and funding from both Moscow and Berlin. Lenin's Comintern had made it clear that Germany was key to the world revolution. If the Bolsheviks could inspire a successful communist uprising in the industrial heart of Europe, it would prove that the Russian Revolution was not an isolated event, but the beginning of a global transformation. When the crisis came, this clarity of purpose would prove decisive. Then there were the Catholic conservatives, soon to form the Bavarian People's Party, or BVP, which represented the 70% of Bavarians who went to mass and hated everything about revolution. They were the biggest party, but as we'll explain in more detail later, they would refuse to govern and stay mostly in the back seat. The BVP embodied traditional Bavaria, Catholic faith, monarchist loyalty, and a deep suspicion of radical change. For these voters, Eisner's revolution was an assault on their every way of life. It was godless socialism, dismantling the natural order that had governed Bavaria for centuries. Their electoral message was simple. The revolution was the work of foreign agitators who didn't understand authentic Bavarian values. They promised to restore Catholic, conservative, monarchist Bavaria. Now, caught between everyone were the Liberal Democrats. These were mostly educated middle-class voters who wanted constitutional democracy without chaos and a liberal economy. And last but not least, we have the Peasants' Leagues. These were rural voters suspicious of both capitalism and socialism, easily seduced by anti-establishment rhetoric. Now, none of these groups trusted each other, at all. Most actively hated each other. So, now that I've given you a picture of what Bavarian politics looked like after the First World War, there's a fundamental problem that I'm sure that you're already seeing. Eisner had just pulled off a revolution with honestly no idea what to do next. The challenges were overwhelming. Bavaria faced a complete economic meltdown as war industries shut down and demobilized soldiers flooded the job market, with city officials struggling to feed their citizens. These soldiers I just mentioned who are returning from the war, they're an important detail. Bavaria was housing 50,000 returned soldiers in makeshift accommodations. So, I want you to picture this. We have a city with a massive population of young men who have military training. They have no economic prospects and growing resentment. I'm sure you can already see where this is going. Every political movement, from communist revolutionaries to right-wing paramilitaries, would recruit from this pool of displaced and angry veterans. Now, the international situation was also making things worse. The proclamation of the Hungarian Soviet Republic under Bela Kun in March of 1919 fundamentally changed the game. This represented the potential spread of Bolshevism into the heart of Europe. For Bavaria, political experimentation was no longer a domestic issue. Any movement towards socialist governance would be interpreted as part of the broader international revolutionary threat by the Allied powers. Eisner was facing opposition from all directions. He was attempting something that may have been inherently ironic. He wanted to create a system based on revolutionary councils while simultaneously respecting parliamentary traditions. It was an ambitious design, but hardly anyone supported it. The council system that was supposed to provide democratic legitimacy instead became a source of chaos. Revolutionary councils sprouted in every major city and virtually every township in Bavaria. Perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 separate bodies with no clear relationship to each other. In some cities, councils seized complete authority, but in others they were dominated by traditional mayors. In heavily Catholic areas, they were barely tolerated at all. Not to be too hard on the guy, but Eisner's personal limitations only compounded these structural problems. He was fundamentally a man of words rather than action. When communist agitators began organizing riots in Munich, Eisner refused to crack down with force. He failed to take security precautions, not because he wanted to aid the communists, but because he didn't believe he had the right to suppress them. By January 1919, Eisner's position in Munich had become unsustainable. Under pressure from all sides, he agreed to hold parliamentary elections to legitimize his government democratically. It was a decision that sealed his fate. The election results announced on January 12th were devastating. In a parliament of 180 seats, Eisner's independent socialists won only 3, with 2.5% of the vote. The moderate Social Democrats captured 61 seats. while the conservative and centrist parties dominated the rest. The message was unmistakable. The Bavarian people overwhelmingly rejected Eisner's revolutionary experiment and wanted a return to moderate, constitutional government. For a Democrat, the path forward should have been clear: accept the people's verdict and step down. But in Eisner's position, it actually wasn't that straightforward. The councils that had brought him to power were dominated by radicals who had no intention of accepting a parliamentary defeat. Many of his supporters argued that the election itself was invalid, that revolutionary councils represented the true voice of the people regardless of ballot results. Again, it goes back to that flimsy definition. What actually is democracy? What is the rule of the people? Meanwhile, conservative forces saw the election as proof that Eisner's entire regime was illegitimate and should be removed by force if necessary. For over a month, Eisner tried to delay the inevitable. The situation became increasingly unstable as radical elements grew more militant and conservative opposition hardened. This was now turning into a full-blown political crisis for Kurt Eisner, but it raises a question. How did the other parties in Bavaria's parliament react to the election? The winners of Bavaria's first democratic election present us with one of history's most perverse ironies. A political party that captured the most votes, but was too terrified to take power. The monarchists were also happy. The party's leadership made it clear that while the king, Ludwig III, might not remount the throne unless called on by the consensus of the Bavarian people, they certainly hoped such a consensus might emerge. The Catholic Party's leadership calculated that it would be better to remain in the opposition, letting others deal with the chaos while they remained in their ideological purity. So, in other words, the party that had just won the election refused to govern. It was a self-defeating stance that guaranteed continued instability. It also created an immediate crisis of legitimacy. If the largest party in Bavaria wouldn't take responsibility for the state, then who would? Their abdication opened the door for more dangerous actors to step in. The responsibility then fell to the second largest party, the Social Democrats. Led by Erhard Auer, the SPD found themselves in the impossible, though not too dissimilar position that Eisner had. They were too radical for the conservatives, but too conservative for the revolutionaries. Auer himself was the perfect representative of moderate social democracy's strengths, but also its fatal limitations. He was a big, imposing man, born illegitimately and raised as an orphan. He had genuine working-class credentials that no one could question. He represented exactly the kind of gradual, democratic socialism that should have been able to build stable coalitions. In the election, they had captured 61 seats and nearly a third of the vote, but their success concealed a fundamental problem. They were being squeezed from both sides by actors who rejected the very premises of democratic politics. From the right, the BVP's refusal to enter a coalition meant that the Social Democrats couldn't assemble a stable majority. From the left, they faced constant pressure from communist radicals and increasingly militant council members who viewed parliamentary democracy itself as a betrayal of revolutionary principles. Furthermore, the personal relationship Auer had with Eisner had deteriorated into something approaching hatred. Where Eisner saw a cautious bureaucrat unwilling to embrace revolutionary transformation, Auer saw a dangerous idealist leading the state towards chaos. The SPD's tragedy was that they likely understood better than anyone else what was at stake. They could see that the revolutionary councils were becoming dominated by extremists, that economic conditions were rapidly declining, and that the window for stable democratic transition was closing. In this crisis, they couldn't suppress the radical councils without violating their principles about free speech and workers' rights. Even if they wanted to, it wasn't possible to form a government with the Catholic conservatives without betraying their secular working class base. And they couldn't cooperate with Eisner's revolutionaries either without legitimizing the very council system they claimed threatened parliamentary democracy. The end result was just pure paralysis, and it came precisely at the moment when strong, decisive democratic leadership was most needed. Kurt Eisner's independent socialists also reacted to the election poorly. It's likely the most tragic failure in this entire story. With only 3 seats out of 180, they had suffered what any objective observer would call a catastrophic electoral defeat. Yet somehow, they convinced themselves this was merely a temporary setback in their grand project of creating a new kind of democracy. After the devastating election results, any practical politician would have accepted defeat and stepped aside. But to Eisner and his party, elections didn't necessarily reflect the true will of the people. Revolutionary councils, after all, represented a higher form of democracy. It was this democratic idealism that made them functionally anti-democratic. By refusing to accept electoral defeat, by insisting that council democracy was superior, by prioritizing ideological purity over practical governance, they helped to discredit the very democratic values they claimed to champion. By early March, as the political crisis deepened, the most dangerous players were watching and waiting. The Bavarian Communist Party had been transformed in early 1919 by the arrival of Eugen Levin, a Russian-born, German-educated revolutionary who had been personally selected by the communist leadership in Berlin to take control of the chaotic Bavarian radical movement. Within weeks of his arrival, Levin had conducted a quiet purge of the party's membership, calling in all membership cards for review and reissuing less than 3,000 of them. He forced out 5 of the 7 members of the party's executive committee, assuming personal control of the party newspaper, and he also began organizing solid communist cells within the factory councils. This was the work of a professional revolutionary who understood that successful political movements require organization, discipline, and strategic planning. But Levin faced an impossible contradiction too. His orders from the communists in Berlin were explicit. Any occasion for military action by governmental troops must be strictly avoided. The communist leadership understood that isolated uprisings in individual German states would be crushed by the Freikorps units that had already suppressed revolutionary movements in Berlin, Bremen, and the Ruhr. Yet when the moment came, Levin would choose to defy these orders and seize power anyway. The German Democratic Party and the Bavarian Peasants' League complete this picture of democratic failure. The DDP, with 25 seats, were large enough to be a crucial swing vote, but they were too small to govern independently. The Peasants' League, with 16 seats, under the leadership of Karl Gandorfer, chose to ally with Eisner's revolutionary independent socialists, convinced that the council system would give rural communities more direct control. This is quite interesting, because it was a decision that perfectly illustrates how populist movements can be seduced by anti-establishment rhetoric, even when that rhetoric comes from movements that are hostile to their core values. So, we are now in a full-blown political crisis, and Kurt Eisner has made his decision. He would appear before the new parliament and formally resign as prime minister, accepting the democratic verdict of the election. Early on the morning of February 21st, Eisner was in his office preparing the statement to be read at the opening session of Parliament. Quote, "In the name of the Cabinet, I declare that all ministers will resign from their offices and place them at the disposal of the Landtag." A few minutes before 10 o'clock, Eisner placed the prepared text in his briefcase and left the office. As he rounded the corner into the Promenadestrasse, a young man stepped forward and fired 2 shots into his head. Kurt Eisner would collapse on the sidewalk, dead. The man who would murder him was Count Anton von Arco-Valley, a young student from one of Bavaria's oldest aristocratic families. Arco-Valley himself embodied some of the contradictions tearing German society apart. Despite his noble name, he was partly Jewish, which had led to his rejection by an anti-Semitic, conservative student organization. The assassination unleashed immediate chaos. It's actually pretty insane. Within 60 minutes of Eisner's death, a member of the Revolutionary Workers' Council named Alois Lindner burst into the parliament and shot Erhard Auer point blank, severely wounding the Social Democratic leader. The fragile thread holding Bavaria's system together had now snapped. What followed was not the restoration of order that conservatives had hoped for, but something far more dangerous. As news of the assassination spread, radical elements that Eisner had struggled to control himself seized the moment. Now, after Kurt Eisner's death, it was the moderate Social Democrats who tried to immediately form a government, but they were blocked by the councils, and to make the situation worse, the conservatives also still refused to take control. Now, you have to remember, while the government is effectively paralyzed, the economic conditions in Bavaria are worsening. Unemployment is rampant, food shortages are becoming more severe, and public order is now beginning to crack. It would be in this atmosphere that some of the radical communists would make their move. On April 6th, while some of the moderate politicians tried to form a government, it would be here, in what used to be the Wittelsbach Palace, that some of the more radical council members would meet, and they made a fateful decision. Monday morning would bring news that Bavaria was now a Soviet republic. Now, the way this happened is honestly super strange. I'm going to try to explain it simply, but basically it was a socialist attempt at 4D chess. The Soviet Republic was not seized by communist revolutionaries. It was, surprisingly, proposed by a moderate social democrat trying to outmaneuver them. In the early morning hours of April 5th, about 100 men gathered in secret at the Ministry for Military Affairs. No minutes were recorded, but the meeting included representatives from every faction: Social Democrats, Communists, Anarchists, army officers, police officials, and radical council members. The most shocking moment came when Ernst Schneppenhorst, the Social Democratic Minister for Military Affairs, stood up and proposed that Bavaria should become a Soviet republic. The room was stunned. Here was a moderate social democrat suggesting the very thing the radicals had been demanding all along. Schneppenhorst's logic was twisted but revealing. He calculated that by drawing the communists into official government responsibility, he could control their agitation and discredit them. It was a dangerous gamble. They would use a Soviet republic to destroy the Soviet Republic. But the proposal created an even more bizarre situation, because Eugen Levin, the communist leader, now rejected Schneppenhorst's offer. So let's recap, because we're in a pretty comedic situation. The communists, ironically, have now opposed the establishment of a Soviet republic because they want to seize power on their own terms, not share it with the Social Democrats. By April 6th, the comedy of errors was truly complete. The SPD leadership in Nuremberg voted 47-6 against the Soviet Republic and ordered Schneppenhorst to withdraw his offer. But it was already too late. A rump session of radical independents, anarchists, and remaining council members convened again at the Wittelsbach Palace. Now, without any support of any of the major political parties, this small group of extremists drafted proclamations and sent them to the printers. On Monday morning, April 7th, Munich woke up to fresh placards pasted on street corners, announcing that Bavaria was now a Soviet republic. This first Soviet government was a disaster, and it only lasted 6 days. There was really no government in charge at all. It was just a flood of contradictory proclamations. The banks would be socialized, the press reorganized, revolutionary tribunals would replace courts, the bourgeoisie would be disarmed, and a Red Army would form. To highlight the comedy of this situation, Gustav Landauer, appointed Commissar for Education, would also be appointed Commissar of Culture, Science, Art, and, quote, a few other things, whatever that means. He would send a postcard jokingly to a friend, observing that Bavarians are not Russians. The communists mockingly called it the pseudo-Soviet Republic, which was probably appropriate, and not just because they were not participating, but because there was literally no functioning government. It was just proclamations. The international situation made the Soviet Republic's position even more desperate. The president of Germany, Friedrich Ebert, now sent a telegram to Munich which laid out the stakes with brutal clarity. The French had offered to send troops to restore order in Bavaria, and threatened to cut off food supplies if the situation were not resolved. The message was unambiguous: crush any revolutionary experiment or face foreign occupation. This chaos created the opening that the professional revolutionaries had finally been waiting for. On April 13th, Palm Sunday, the moderate Soviet government was overthrown in a carefully planned coup by the German Communist Party, led by Eugen Levin. Levin was everything that Eisner had not been. He was disciplined, dogmatic, and utterly committed to revolutionary violence.
Now, the communist seizure of power was far more dramatic than the confused proclamations that came the week before. When Republican security troops tried to launch a counter-coup, a fierce battle erupted here at Munich's train station, in which they would be defeated. 100 people lay wounded and over 20 dead. What was clear as the dust settled was that this was not the end, but just the beginning of the communist civil war in Munich. That evening, Levin would find himself here at the Hofbräuhaus in Munich. He would be elected chairman of what they called the Executive Committee of the real Soviet Republic. Bavaria, they declared, finally erected a rule of the proletariat. But from the moment he took power, Levin knew his situation was precarious. Bavaria was surrounded by enemies. Hungary had been invaded by the Romanians. Russia was embroiled in a civil war. Northern Germany was a stronghold of the Freikorps. And to make it all worse, the German states had now gathered together and denounced the government, recognizing the exiled one in Bamberg. But for a man like Levin and the people around him, these practical considerations were of no importance. They were followers of a radical ideology where struggle was the whole point. Success or failure simply didn't matter. Even in defeat, they would set an example and radicalize the rest of the working class. They would not compromise between heaven and hell. They would not negotiate between communism and capitalism.
The economics were also making Levin's position more desperate. Bavaria was completely blockaded. There were few provisions and no prospect of obtaining more. The communists' response revealed their fundamental disconnect from reality. They banned the churning of milk into butter or cheese as sabotage against the Soviet Republic. By late April, milk too was forbidden to all but those certified by physicians to be in immediate danger of death. Meanwhile, they continued issuing proclamations about the coming world revolution. Even within Levin's own regime, opposition was growing. Ernst Tolle, the poet who had become a military commander, began questioning the wisdom of continuing a hopeless fight. On April 27th, after just 2 weeks in power, the Hofbräuhaus Parliament returned a vote of no confidence to Levin's government. But it was too late for a peaceful resolution. The military commander, Rudolf Egelhofer, refused to accept the political decision, declaring that the Red Army existed to defend the dictatorship of the proletariat, not to serve as an instrument of politics. Munich was now ruled firmly by the gun and not the ballot. The vote of no confidence would be ignored. What followed was a civil war that had become inevitable since the moment that Kurt Eisner was assassinated. The Hoffmann government in exile, under pressure from Berlin and with support from Freikorps units, launched a full-scale military assault on Munich. By May 1st, troops had closed a tight ring around the city and prepared for the final assault.
Now, the communists knew that they were doomed. Eugen Levine would go on to tell his wife that hard times were to come, but that one should have the feeling that they were unavoidable. Now, the original plan was for the Freikorps to move into the city on May the 2nd at noon, but at the crucial moment, they got news that 10 hostages had been killed here at Luitpold Gymnasium in Munich. This sent the situation completely into chaos. The man who gave the order, Rudolf Egelhofer, well, he was a young and fanatical communist. He had originally taken 50 hostages as an insurance, but when he heard the final assault was coming, he gave the order to execute. This would be the final straw in an already fragile situation for Munich.
The hostage murders were a final gesture of revolutionary defiance that accomplished nothing except to guarantee that the communist leaders themselves would receive no mercy. It was both wicked and futile, turning what might have been a relatively restrained military occupation into a real slaughter. Some of the aroused Freikorps troops now broke formation hearing the news, disobeying orders, and beginning to move into the city with anger in their eyes. Any resistance was now quickly and ruthlessly broken. Men found carrying or hiding weapons were shot without trial and often without question. By May 3rd, the city was quiet again and the dead numbered over 600. The Freikorps controlled Munich. The city was finally sobered into silence by news that 21 innocent victims had been killed by Freikorps troops seeking revenge, men who had been mistakenly identified as Red Army soldiers. The wheel of violence that began with Kurt Eisner's assassination had now come full circle, leaving Munich devastated and Bavaria traumatized by the experience of revolutionary extremism.
Here at the Kurt Eisner Monument in Munich, we can safely say that those 163 days show that you can't just overthrow a monarchy and then peacefully accept democratic defeat. It would be the conservatives who called Eisner a threat. It would be the radicals who called him a traitor. And the moderates, well, they were too powerless to do anything to save him. It would teach an entire generation of Germans that democracy was weak and, well, extremism, at least it was honest. Bavaria in 1919 would be the dress rehearsal for the collapse of the Weimar Republic.
But perhaps more importantly, Germany now had its first taste of real communist revolution. For 6 weeks, Munich lived under red flags and revolutionary terror. Hostages were executed, Freikorps units marched in and took control. Most Germans had never seen communism in action before Bavaria in 1919. What they witnessed was chaos, violence, and economic collapse. The very word Soviet became associated not with worker liberation, but with bloodshed and disorder. When real communists later tried to build support across Germany, they faced a population that remembered Munich's corpses. 14 years later, when another extremist movement promised to restore order through force, Germans remembered which tactics had actually proven effective on Munich streets. Hi everyone, thanks so much for watching. I just want to take a moment, as I do at the end of each video, to say how incredibly grateful I am for your amazing support. I try to read as many of your comments as I can, and they often do make my mornings and my days. I also wanted to share something exciting. In my spare time, I've been developing The Infanterist. It's a completely free-to-play, browser-based strategy game. If you'd like to learn more, stay updated, or connect with our growing community, you can join the Discord using the link below. We play video games, chat, suggest video ideas, and to be honest, it's just awesome to meet you and talk to you directly as well. So once again, thanks so much for watching, and as always, stay curious about history.